Two horrific murders occurred in two small towns, hundreds of kilometers apart. At first glance, they appeared completely unrelated. But then, investigators made a chilling discovery. Both crimes are connected to the same criminal network. Now, law enforcement and the FBI were racing to untangle a web of lies and stop a gang that targeted victims simply for their identities. Identity theft costs the U.S. billions of dollars each year, and sometimes it costs innocent people their lives. My name is Jim Carlstrom, former head of the FBI's New York field office. Back in 1999, one particular murder kicked off a multi-state manhunt. The killer wasn't just taking lives. He was also stealing his victims' identities and vanishing without a trace. On March 10th, the Henderson County Sheriff's Department in Kentucky received a bizarre call. A man reported that a stranger was lurking around his house, had broken into his car, and was now sitting inside, laying on the horn nonstop. When officers arrived at the scene, they found a 62-year-old man in the car, soaked to bone and suffering from severe hypothermia. He identified himself as Richard Dorman. According to Dorman, he had been kidnapped by two men and thrown into the Green River. He claimed he broke into the vehicle just to call for help. The police rushed him to the hospital. Lieutenant Frank Grover from the Henderson County Sheriff's Department was assigned to question him. While the name Richard Dorman didn't ring any bells, his face certainly did. Grover instantly recognized Dorman from a photo the department had been circulating for weeks. They had been searching for this exact man ever since a farmer named Jack Norris was found murdered in his home in Henderson, Kentucky. On February 3rd, Lieutenant Grover was called to Norris's property after a neighbor reported something strange in a shed connected to the main house. The structure was packed with hay, stacked from floor to ceiling, leaving just a narrow path through the middle, and that's where they found the body. The scene was immediately identified as a homicide. Jack Norris had been brutally attacked, his body drenched in blood. Something had punctured his back repeatedly, and a pickaxe was found near the entrance, stained with blood on both the handle and the head. Investigators combed the surrounding area. Near a stack of firewood, Grover found even more dried blood and blood spatter across the logs, strong evidence that this was a real crime scene. Next to the woodpile, they discovered a heavy iron bar, also covered in blood. Whoever had used such a weapon had been fueled by pure rage. This wasn't just violence. It was personal, intentional, and filled with aggression. They turned their focus to Norris's house, hoping to find a clue to explain such a senseless killing. The place was a mess. Drawers and cabinets were ransacked. Either the killer had taken their time, or there was more than one person involved. Oddly, nothing of value seemed to be missing. Even the victim's wallet was still in his pocket. One detail stood out. The calendar was still turned to Sunday, January 31st. It hadn't been flipped to February 1st. Based on this, and confirmed later by uncollected mail, detectives believe the murder had occurred early Monday morning. Neighbors gave a helpful lead. They said Norris had two wallets, and one of them was missing, the one that contained his ID. The other wallet, holding miscellaneous items, was still on him. The missing ID was a mystery, especially since it seemed nothing else had been taken, except for some personal checks. Detectives remembered an empty checkbook box at the scene. Grover began to suspect that the motive might be tied to financial fraud. Word of the murder quickly spread through the town, leaving residents frightened and puzzled. Who would do this? And why? Days passed with no solid leads, until a surprising break came from a bank in Union County. They had received a suspicious check from Jack Norris's account. The signature didn't match. It had been forged. Only the ID and several checks had been taken from Norris's home. Maybe the stolen checks would lead police straight to the killer. When detectives visited the bank, employees showed them security footage of the man who had tried to cash the check. A gray-haired man had shown up at the bank, using the name Cleo Kemple. That man, as it turned out, was Richard Dorman. Just a few hours after Jack Norris's murder, Dorman had walked into the bank under that false identity and tried to cash one of Norris's checks for just over $10,000, which nearly matched the exact balance of Norris's account. Lieutenant Grover knew who Dorman was, but he couldn't figure out why he was posing as Cleo Kemple. So Grover began digging. He searched local and national records for anyone named Cleo Kemple who matched Dorman's description. He even checked online databases. Every time he found someone with that name, he'd contact the nearest police department, only to be told it wasn't the right person. Weeks went by. No Cleo Kemple could be found. It was as if the identity had never existed. Then Grover heard something intriguing. One of the victims in a robbery down in Alabama had also been using the name Kemple. Now more curious than ever, Grover confronted Dorman directly. "Hey, Cleo," he said casually. "Mind if I call you that? That's the name I know you by." Dorman's eyes widened. He realized he had been caught. Calmly, he responded, "I don't mean any disrespect, but this is beyond your jurisdiction. You should probably talk to the FBI." Grover contacted the Bureau, and Special Agent Paul was assigned to the case. When Agent Paul questioned Dorman, what he heard was astonishing. Dorman claimed he had met a man named Charlie Stewart at a truck stop in Clarksville. According to him, Stewart was the ringleader of a crew that specialized in check fraud. They'd steal checks and cash them using fake identities. Dorman admitted he was one of those check runners. Charlie had given him the fake identity Cleo Kemple, along with one of Norris's checks. But the night before Dorman was kidnapped, Charlie told him something had gone wrong, and they needed to talk. While Dorman was waiting in his car, a man approached and asked, "Are you Richard Dorman?" Dorman replied yes, and before he could react, the man pulled out a stun gun and attacked him. At the same time, an older man walked up to the car, pulled a gun, and aimed at him. Dorman froze. "What's going on?" he asked. The older man answered, "Charlie wants to see you." The two men drove Dorman north, eventually pulling off near the Green River in Kentucky. They got out, opened the trunk, and handed Dorman a cigarette. "We're taking you to Charlie," one of them said, "but first you need to get in the trunk." Dorman had no choice. After handing over his wallet, the car suddenly began rolling right into the Green River. The crash threw open the trunk. Dorman managed to swim out before the vehicle sank. Grabbing onto a piece of driftwood, he floated downstream, nearly freezing to death. He later told authorities he had never seen his two attackers before, but he was convinced they worked for Charlie Stewart. Lieutenant Grover already knew that name well. Charlie Stewart was notorious in that part of Kentucky, suspected in a range of crimes. Now, it looked like he might also be tied to the murder of Jack Norris. Meanwhile, back in Henderson, a man claiming to have been nearly drowned in the Green River by two attackers was insisting that Charlie Stewart was behind the entire plot. Around the same time in Morgan County, Alabama, just 5 days after Norris's body had been discovered, police got another disturbing call. A car had been found in a rock quarry, its front end submerged in water. Inside the trunk, officers discovered a blanket, a stack of documents, and the body of a man. His wrists were bound. His face was covered in duct tape. He wasn't breathing. No heartbeat. No movement. He was dead. Detective Terry Kelly from a Morgan County Sheriff's Office was called in. In murder cases, he explained, the first officer on the scene steps back as soon as foul play is suspected, allowing the homicide team to take over. The scene was locked down. Forensic experts were called in, but waiting for them was nerve-wracking, knowing that any mishandling of evidence could weaken the case in court. As the forensic team arrived at the rock quarry, they immediately began processing the scene. The victim, a white male appearing to be in his late 40s or early 50s, was examined thoroughly. Investigators photographed everything, took measurements, and carefully dusted the car for fingerprints. There was plenty of physical evidence to work with, but when they opened the other door of the vehicle, something unexpected happened. Under a large blanket, something moved. Someone spotted it and gasped. No one had been prepared for this. "Call an ambulance," someone yelled. Beneath that blanket was a woman. She had been severely beaten. Her wrists were bound, and duct tape was tightly wrapped over her mouth. The woman was still alive. Her name was Florence Nichols. Once stabilized, she told investigators everything she could remember. She and her son James had just returned home from a flea market. James was a small business owner who sold weapons, guitars, and other musical instruments from his home-based shop. They had lived in the Iowa area all their lives. Not long after they got home, there was a knock at the door. A young man stood outside, asking for directions. But as soon as the door opened, he forced his way in and attacked Florence. She said she heard a second voice inside the house. The second man had gone down the hallway toward the room where her son was. Within moments, Florence was thrown into the trunk of her own van. Something heavy landed on top of her. It was the lifeless body of her son. According to Florence, the van drove for only a few minutes before it stopped. She was trapped in the trunk, underneath her son's body, for what felt like 14 to 16 hours. All that time, she feared she would be next. It's almost unbelievable that she survived, but somehow she did. Florence described the attacker at the door as a young man, maybe in his early 20s. She never got a look at the second man, and she couldn't understand why anyone would want to kill her or her son. When detectives searched the Nichols home for clues, they found something puzzling. Nothing seemed to be stolen. James had a collection of valuable items, firearms, rare knives, and collector's items, but none of them appeared to be missing. This wasn't a typical robbery. So why had they killed James? What was the real motive here? Investigators combed through the house once more, this time with Florence's help. As she looked through her belongings, she realized a few things were gone after all. Some collectible weapons, a few knives, $200 in cash, and James's checkbook. If those checks showed up somewhere, they might point directly to the killers. In a strange way, that was the breakthrough they needed. Now, the FBI and local police were officially linking 2 murders and a series of robberies to one man, Charlie Stewart. There were striking similarities between the killings in Alabama and Kentucky. Both victims had been murdered, so their identities could be stolen. That was no coincidence. Lieutenant Frank Grover was now the connecting thread between the 2 cases. Everything was lining up, but they still needed to track down Stewart. Investigators turned up the pressure on Richard Dorman. Eventually, he caved and revealed everything he knew about Charlie Stewart and his criminal operation. For years, Stewart had recruited men who looked similar to each other. He would supply them with stolen identities, often from men who had been murdered, and send them into banks with forged checks. It was slick, professional, and dangerous. These weren't sloppy criminals. They were calculated and methodical. Ironically, Dorman almost became a victim of the very same crew he had worked with. His kidnappers had stripped him of his fake ID and tried to drown him in the Green River. So far, the FBI and police had identified 2 key members of the gang: Dorman, who was now in custody, and Stewart, who remained at large, along with others who had yet to be named. The clock was ticking. Authorities hoped Dorman's cooperation would lead them to the rest of the crew before someone else lost their life. At this point, law enforcement teams in both Alabama and Kentucky were fully committed. Their main suspect, Charlie Stewart. Back in Alabama, a new lead came in. A van containing a dead man had been discovered. Lying beside him was his mother, beaten but still breathing. Just one night earlier, police had received a tip about a stolen tractor. The caller said the vehicle had been abandoned near a quarry. When officers arrived at the quarry, they discovered a gray 1977 Pontiac Grand Prix. The engine was still warm, but the driver was nowhere to be found. The responding officer jotted down the license plate number and began searching the area. But by the time he returned, the vehicle had vanished. What made this even stranger was that the car had originally been parked just 140 meters from where the van with the victim's body had been found. That couldn't be a coincidence. This car was now a key piece of evidence. Detective Terry Kelly immediately issued a statewide alert for the Pontiac. Every police unit in the area was notified. Once the press caught wind of it, reporters began calling. Authorities confirmed they were looking for the vehicle in connection with a homicide investigation. All they wanted, they said, was to speak with the driver and find out if they had seen anything suspicious. Tips began pouring in, but none of them led to the missing vehicle. Then, a few days later, someone walked into Morgan County Sheriff's Office with a lead. He told investigators they should look into a man named Larry Butler, who drove a gray Pontiac Grand Prix. Apparently, Butler had skipped town on a motorcycle around the same time James Nichols was murdered, and his car had completely vanished. But when the police pulled up Butler's file, they found something even more concerning. Larry Butler wasn't his real name. It was just one of many aliases used by none other than Charlie Stewart. Stewart had a rap sheet a mile long: burglary, armed robbery, assault, and an active warrant in Florida. If a man with that kind of history disappeared the same night someone was murdered, police had every reason to be suspicious. Lieutenant Chuck Sander from the Morgan County Sheriff's Office went to Stewart's last known address, a rundown trailer out in the woods. Stewart's wife claimed she had no idea where her husband was. Investigators also questioned neighbors. One of them admitted something strange. Stewart had once asked him to cash a forged check. That immediately set off red flags. The neighbor had refused, but he was terrified of Stewart. He feared the man might burn down his trailer, wait outside, and shoot him. That's the kind of man Stewart was. Dangerous, unpredictable, and willing to kill. The neighbor also reported seeing Stewart the day before James Nichols was killed. He was in a car with two other men. Unfortunately, he couldn't make out their faces. The investigation hit another dead end. With Stewart still missing, the FBI and police were back to square one. Dorman was behind bars, but he couldn't lead them directly to Stewart. Then finally, weeks later, the break they'd been hoping for came in. Special Agent Paul Papp got a call from a woman claiming to have the information they desperately needed. According to her, the murders were carried out by two men, Billy Lyon and his father, Larry Lyon, both resident of Henderson, Kentucky. She said Billy had even bragged about an upcoming robbery. He planned to hit a tobacco shop in Indiana, kill the owner, and take the safe. This meant the threat wasn't over. Another murder was likely on the horizon, and they had to act fast. Lieutenant Grover and Agent Papp quickly assembled a photo lineup, filled with images of men who resembled each other. They showed the collection to Dorman. Without hesitation, he pointed to Larry and Billy Lyon. Surveillance teams were dispatched to monitor Billy's house in Evansville, Indiana, and Larry's home in Henderson, Kentucky. The plan was to get warrants for both of them and search their properties and vehicles in both states. But then the situation took an unexpected turn. Billy left his house and began driving toward Henderson to see his father. They couldn't risk losing track of him. If he was going to meet up with Larry to plan another murder, they had to intervene. As soon as he crossed into Kentucky, local police and FBI agents pulled him over and placed him under arrest. At the police station in Evansville, agents continued questioning Billy Lyon. His nervous body language revealed everything. They could tell he was already emotionally defeated. Meanwhile, officers stationed outside his father's house noticed something alarming. Larry Lyon suddenly rushed out and sped away. Authorities feared he had found out about his son's arrest and was trying to make a run for it. Police followed his vehicle and eventually pulled him over. "Hands out the window!" "Now!" they shouted. But Larry had other plans. Instead of complying, he turned a gun on himself. He was rushed to the hospital in Evansville, but didn't survive the self-inflicted gunshot wound. Back at the station, Agent Paul continued interrogating Billy. Paul considered telling him about his father's death, but he decided against it, fearing it might shut down the entire interrogation. The questioning continued. At first, it was like pulling teeth. Billy didn't want to talk, but little by little, he opened up. He admitted that Charlie Stewart was the mastermind behind the murders of Jack Norris and James Nichols. He also linked Stewart to Richard Dorman's kidnapping and attempted drowning. According to Billy, Stewart gave the orders, and everyone followed them. He called Stewart a psychopath, someone who was calculating, emotionless, and incredibly dangerous. With this confession, the FBI and police in both Kentucky and Alabama were now on high alert. They were hunting a gang of identity thieves who were willing to kill just to get someone's driver's license. Only one member of the group was still free, Charlie Stewart. But he wouldn't be easy to catch. His former associates described him as a survivalist, smart, elusive, able to vanish into the wilderness for long periods of time. Detective Terry Kelly had already been after him for over a year. Stewart was known to stash money in hidden locations and had mastered the art of disguise. He could change his appearance so completely that even his friends wouldn't recognize him. A joint task force of FBI agents and local police searched Stewart's trailer and the surrounding area. While they didn't find direct evidence linking him to the murders, they did find something telling. A secret trapdoor cut into the floor of the trailer, a built-in escape route. They also discovered a van hidden behind some bushes. Using a concealed phone line, Stewart had wired the trailer so he could communicate without being seen. Inside the van, investigators found 20 firearms and a large supply of ammunition. It was enough for a serious standoff. They knew then, bringing this man in wasn't going to be easy. If they tried to arrest him head-on, they might end up in a shootout. He had clearly been preparing for this day for a long time. Despite everything, Stewart had one weakness: his family. Agents kept circling back to his wife, trying to get her to talk. She insisted she hadn't heard from him, but confidential informants said otherwise. They believed she was hiding him, and that she was terrified of him at the same time. Months passed. No sightings, no solid leads. The case went cold and frustration built among the team. They followed every tip, searched every corner, and still nothing. Then, nearly a year later, the case was featured on a national TV show. Unlike most high-profile segments, this one brought in very few tips. Usually, a case on television leads to a flood of phone calls. But here, almost silence. That meant only one thing. Stewart was still hiding, either underground or deep in the woods of Alabama, territory he knew like the back of his hand. Agents interviewed some of Stewart's former neighbors, but most were too scared to say a word. They believed that speaking up would be the same as signing their own death warrant. One agent remembered, "They were terrified, but slowly we gained their trust. Eventually, some of them opened up." One neighbor revealed something important. Stewart's wife had recently bought a sleeping bag and clothing much too large for her kids, including size 11 shoes. Their teenage son was only 14 and definitely didn't wear shoes that big. It became clear someone was hiding out, and it wasn't a kid. The team decided to act. They needed someone close to Stewart to make contact. They found an old friend of his who agreed to help. He'd known Stewart for years. The FBI wired him with a hidden microphone, hoping he could draw Stewart out during a casual conversation. The situation was tense. They knew Stewart could be dangerous, and this operation had to go perfectly. The informant headed towards Stewart's trailer. The informant approached the trailer and knocked. No one answered. He started walking back down the dirt path toward his car, but as he glanced in his rearview mirror, he thought he saw movement near the trailer. He turned around but saw nothing. Still, he was convinced. "I swear," he told the agents, "he's in there. I saw something. I know it was him." Special Agent Paul knew they couldn't rush him blindly. Stewart was dangerous and possibly armed. Charging in recklessly could get someone hurt, or worse. They needed a strategy. Stewart was wanted on multiple charges: bank fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and homicide. The FBI and Alabama police believed he had gone off the grid and was living in the woods, possibly in a tent or a cave. They suspected he might return home only briefly after dark to check in with his family, then vanish again by sunrise. Agent Terry Kelly and a few others disguised themselves as hunters and began sweeping the forest. When enough evidence confirmed that Stewart might be hiding nearby, Lieutenant Chuck Sander and Kelly deployed a trained K-9 unit. Kelly had spent over a year working this case with no sign of Stewart. He admitted later, "I didn't think we'd find him. Otherwise, I would have brought more men." But the dogs quickly picked up a scent near Stewart's trailer, and the chase was on. They followed the trail deep into the forest and up to a hunting stand. It was empty, but Stewart couldn't be far. The dogs continued tracking his scent to a stream and then to a small cave tucked into the hillside. The agents didn't know what they'd find inside. Flashlights revealed fresh supplies: food, a sleeping bag, parts of a camping kit. Someone had definitely been living there recently. Suddenly, one of the officers sprinted toward the team, shouting, "We've got something!" They had located Stewart's hideout. "Captain, my radio to command center, requesting backup and air support." Soon, more officers from the FBI, local police, and sheriff's departments were surrounding the area. Altogether, 20 to 30 officers moved in, coordinating every step. Following directions from a K-9 team, they tightened the perimeter slowly, closing in from all sides. "I wanted to trap him," said Sander, "to leave him no room to run." After hours of combing through the forest, a fellow officer radioed in. They had spotted a man fleeing the tree line. It was Stewart. He drew a weapon. "Drop the gun." "Now!" officers shouted. For a terrifying moment, no one knew what would happen next. Shots rang out. But seconds later, word came through. No one was hurt. And more importantly, Charlie Stewart was finally in custody. It had been a grueling, year-and-a-half-long manhunt. Stewart's stare was described as chilling, cold and lifeless. Officers who encountered him were just relieved that he was now behind bars. In January 2002, Charlie Stewart and his gang stood trial. The verdict: guilty on all counts, including bank fraud, kidnapping, and murder. Richard Dorman received a life sentence. So did Billy Lyon. Charlie Lewis Stewart was found guilty of every charge and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Authorities believe Stewart was the mastermind behind the entire operation. He ordered Larry and Billy Lyon to rob and murder Jack Norris and James Nichols. He then passed the stolen IDs to Dorman, who used them to empty the victims' bank accounts. Chillingly, Stewart selected victims based on whether they resembled Dorman. 2 innocent men died simply because they looked like someone else. But thanks to the tireless efforts of law enforcement and the FBI, these ruthless killers are now permanently off the streets, and exactly where they belong, behind bars.